It's KBKW's Coffee Talk. It is now 7:13, and we have Stephen Arms with us. And good morning, Stephen.
Good morning, Doug.
And, of course, you're a local individual that has a long history of teaching history. And so one of the things that we're going to do today is we're going to be discussing the amendments to the Constitution, including the Second Amendment, but kind of give people a little bit of a background.
Well, I used to teach United States history and Western civilization mostly for Fresno City College in California, and I taught for about a year at California State University, Fresno. And I've written commercially for Wadsworth Longman Publishing. I used to edit their study information and their test guides and their online resources for them. I started out writing reviews of their texts, and they disliked my reviews so much they put me actually writing test data for them so I could help them a little bit.
Okay. Now, what did you find the way the textbooks were written and the tests were written? What was the issue that you've had with most of them?
I think that you should try to be objective when you're talking about history, and that you shouldn't put your own bias into it as little as you can. Everyone has some of it, but I would read through these books and I would go, this is not factually accurate because the person, or it is, and the person is putting such a taint on it that it's not actually conveying the facts that happened at the time. And that would be a lot of the reviews I was writing for them.
So what would be an example of that so people know kind of what you mean?
People put in their text different agendas. You can talk about, say, the 1960s, about the entire counterculture movement of the 60s, and you can portray it as a bunch of anarchists running around burning schools, or you can portray it as a bunch of wonderful individuals who are altruistically shaping the future. And one way or the other is not accurate. Mm-hmm. You need to give the information, is what I always thought, and then let the people make their own decision on it. I mean, you have to make it interesting to your classes, but I saw a lot of bias, and I would write that in my review. So eventually they finally came to me and said, well, how would you like to write test batteries for us or fix our online websites? And because of that, I could even take the taint of a professor's book, and I could ask questions that would actually make somebody be more objective. Let your people look at both sides of an issue and come to their own conclusions.
So is that real common in textbooks?
Oh, it's very common, at least in my dealings with them. When I was teaching, there are dozens of texts you can use for history. I would go through them because you can get them. They'll come out and give them to you. The book dealers will come out, and I would go through them and find ones that I consider to be that would give a basic information to my students, and then we could discuss it in class. I would give them the information, and then we would discuss matters in class, much sometimes to the chagrin of my students, because sometimes I'll argue the counterpoint of whatever they're arguing. So, and that also made for good discussion, but it made people actually learn about history, that we're moving through history. History is everything around us. It isn't just a bunch of dead old people somewhere. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, it shapes where we're going, and it says where we are right now.
Now, what's your take on say, for instance, Ken Burns documentaries? Do you consider them to be fairly accurate or not?
I've only seen very little of them.
Oh, okay.
But I have. The ones I've seen seem to be the information's accurate, but there's always that concept of how are you portraying it? So I'm not that, like I said, but unfortunately I'm not that familiar with him.
No, he's I've probably watched maybe 6 or 7 different documentaries. He's got one on Vietnam right now, which I haven't seen yet, but I've been told that it's, of course, for anybody that grew up during that time period or was in Vietnam or was in the Army, I mean, it definitely brings back some memories a lot of people won't forget.
The Vietnam War, I mean, I didn't serve. I'm just slightly a little too young to have been a Vietnam vet. I have great respect for them, Vietnam vets, because I have a lot of friends who are vets. And almost never accurately portrayed in lectures and in modern times. I had a lady in one of my classes who was one of the last copters heading out at the end of the war. Her family was, and we talked about the Vietnam War, and she came up afterwards and she told me, and I always remember this because she said she thanked me for actually giving a real portrayal of what happened there. That we didn't hold up to our obligations in Vietnam. We promised those people we'd help them, and we didn't. And that that's accurate. And it's an embarrassment to us, and it dishonors our soldiers who died there, who easily are some of the bravest men, especially to serve in a war that had become so unpopular in the country, mostly because of the portrayal of it, not because of what was actually happening.
But the war goes clear back into the early 1900s.
Well, I mean,
because there was war on.
Well, the Asian Peninsula always has had war, but the struggles. But at least, I mean, you can get into the major aspects of the Vietnam War back into the 1950s. Obviously, in the Eisenhower administration, and in the Kennedy administration, then came, of course, to Johnson.
Now, I don't know how much truth there is this. In fact, I saw it on a documentary the other day. They were talking about the fact that Kennedy probably would not have reinforced the troops in Vietnam, that he was seriously thinking about just pulling the troops out. Is that what
I've read that also. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's in that line of what if history, and you can only go so far in that before you get lost on the trail. But I know that Kennedy realized that the position was becoming untenable there. I mean, and Johnson doubled down on it, and in some ways made it much worse. I mean, obviously, funny enough that Richard Nixon was the one who actually had to resolve it in the end. But I would agree. I would agree. I've read that, but again, it's conjecture. Based on
all history would have to be, because you're still depending on people's observations, and
you depend on people's observation. But you can always. I mean, obviously, if Kennedy hadn't been assassinated and he had pulled out, then it wouldn't be conjecture. It'd be
right.
It would be we did that. Johnson doubled down, and because of that, led to deaths that were very unnecessary in a lot of other places, not just Vietnam. I mean, you talk about Cambodia and a bunch of other places too.
And the Agent Orange, which to me is like poisoning your troops and poisoning a lot of innocent people.
No kidding.
Well, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back with Stephen Arms. It's KBKW's Coffee Talk. 7:21 is the time. Stephen Arms is our guest. And now, of course, you've studied, you're a history teacher, you've studied the amendments. Of course, the Second Amendment is the one people talk about the most today. And so kind of fill us in on what your interpretation of the Second Amendment is, or what you maybe feel is the proper interpretation.
Well, I mean... Or
is there?
Well, there is always some debate on it. There's been quite a few, Supreme Court cases on it, about a dozen of them over the history of the United States. The last ones were in 2008 and 2010, actually. But, the Second Amendment is that a well-regulated militia be necessary to secure a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It seems kind of straightforward, but people argue over some of the degrees on it. I think the one word that in modern context people lose on is the word militia. People now think of militia as the National Guard. Well, when you look at history, you need to look at history from the point of view of history. In the 1600s and the 1700s, when the Constitution was written in the late 1700s, a militia was considered a citizen army. Militia is a Latin word, miles, meaning warrior. But it was thought of as a citizen army, not an army that was that has been drafted. It's a group of people who are lawfully, with or without drill, performing the duties they need to do to protect the country. So, so if you think of it in that context, which is how it should be thought of, the right of the people to keep, meaning own, and bear arms shall not be infringed. The reason people think that the Second Amendment exists so that people can have guns. In essence, that is true, but it's being able to protect themselves in general. Thomas Jefferson is probably one of the most, some people consider the founder of the Democratic Party in a lot of ways. But Jefferson said the strongest reason for the people to retain and keep the right to bear arms is as a last resort to protect themselves from tyranny of government. Yes, you have a right to protect yourself, but one of the people you need, the Second Amendment exists to protect people also from tyranny. Because the lesson of history, you can go back to Stalin and Hitler and Mao. First rule you do is you disarm your people. Well, you control the media and take away free speech. And then you take away the people's ability to protect themselves, and then you can lead them anywhere you want.
Now, do you think that the culture of this country and the number of arms and the fact that you probably could not, this is just my opinion here, you could not get the military to back a government that was telling them to take the arms away from the citizens. I don't think that
I don't
would
think
fly.
they could do that either. From my opinion, I have great respect for the military and soldiers in general. But the problem is that do you assert people's rights slowly and find ways to take it away? This is one of the argument they have on gun control in general.
Right.
I mean, can you say, well, I don't think we would need to do it because I don't think the military back it up. But does that mean the government doesn't want to take away your rights? That, you know, there are a lot of people in the country right now who look at things and their answer is you need to have more control. You need to take away from people. You need to trust people less and have government be stronger. That's kind of the opposite of what the whole tension of the Constitution was.
So how much do you think? Because and of course now a lot of people think that we have an empire, which is probably true. I mean, we have troops all over the world in every conceivable place, and I think that the country tends to be rather warlike in reality.
Well, the Americans in general are, because we are thought of as being. America is a beacon of freedom, whether people want to admit that or not, and we do have an obligation to help people who need our help. If you want the world to be run by dictators entirely, then by all means have the United States not be involved in it. But if you want the world to actually have the possibilities of having people having liberty and freedom and their ability to control their own lives.
Well, wouldn't that make us different than the other empires? Because I don't think the English Empire was that way, or the French Empire.
But an empire also gets something out of it. When you have colonies, you go in. I mean, we don't go in and conquer areas. I mean, we have a few territories left over from the Spanish-American War. But I mean, the United States doesn't want to come in and take over your country. If that were the case,
yeah. But we meddle we meddle with politicians. I mean, Noriega would have been one, in Panama, and
we do. But I'm not sure that. I mean, Iraq. What would be the situation in Iraq now if we'd actually built the state there, did state building that people claim that we were doing? I mean, they had free elections, and I remember the exuberation of the people and the pictures of their thumbs with the ink on it. They actually got to vote for the first time. And then, of course, we pulled out military force, and the country went to hell in a handbasket.
But did we kind of pick and choose who they were going to elect anyway? I mean, wasn't that all kind of under our control?
It's an arguable opinion.
Oh, okay.
I mean, did we? Do we have an influence on it? Of course. Did we actually make it? I mean, they didn't seem to think so at the time. But then again, if you have to be careful, because then you end up with ISIS.
So in your mind, then, taking police actions as we do, or the policemen of the world is probably the thing that we should be doing.
I think we have to do it carefully. I think we have to reason it out. I mean, this goes back to Theodore Roosevelt. I did my historiographical piece on Theodore Roosevelt when I got my master's degree. And Roosevelt believed that, we had what's called the Roosevelt Doctrine, that the United States was protecting North and South America in those cases, because there was a lot of European countries that were trying to come over and take over South America, for example. I mean, so do we have I think we have to be careful in our use of force, but I do think that if we aren't going to support republics, democracies in the world, who else is going to do it? The British don't have the capability anymore. I mean, you look at the United Nations, and we talk about all the wonderful things of the 187 nations in the United Nations. And if you go through and look at them carefully, 2/3 of them are forms of dictatorships.
That's true. That's true.
So exactly, who are we standing up against? And I go 2/3 of the world.
But is that our business? And don't some countries, devil's advocate here, they seem to thrive better when they have somebody that's in power and leaves when they want to leave than others.
I'm not sure that a tyrant coming in and taking over a country and running it like a team of horses, it pulls very efficiently, but do you want to be part of a team of horses?
Well, I sure as wouldn't want to be a team of horses. Well, that's our signal that we're done with this half hour, but we're going to take a break, and then we'll be back with Stephen Arms. And if you have any comments or questions, you know what that number is once we get out of our break, 360-533-5259. It's KBKW's Coffee Talk. 7:37 is the time. Stephen Arms is our guest, and he's, of course, a historian that was teaching in how many different colleges or universities did you teach in?
Well, I taught at Fresno City College mostly, but I taught also at my old alma mater, California State University, Fresno. I taught there for about a year.
So how did you get interested in history? Was that always one of your favorite subjects
I was
in school?
interested in it when I was young, but after I had been married for a while, I actually was a person who I'd worked actually as in emergency medical services. I was an ambulance driver and an emergency medical dispatcher for a lot of years, and I got my family going and everything. And then came back to school actually in my 30s. And
wow!
I'd gotten my associate arts degree earlier on, but I came back and did my BA and my MA actually when I was in my 30s and started teaching in my 40s. So it was a different situation. I was definitely ready for it then. So
a lot of people argue that the First Amendment's more important than the Second, or the Second Amendment's more important than the First Amendment. What's your take on that?
I think the First Amendment is the First Amendment for a reason, because it is the fundamental crux of this country is freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. Because again, they were put in place. Again, the whole Federalist, anti-Federalist argument when the Constitution was being formed initially, the Bill of Rights were not in the original Constitution. They were a compromise in the Constitutional Convention to allow people to have insurances that the government would not become tyrannical, because they just come from a tyrannical government, of course, to King George. And so the First Amendment is crucial. But I think it's interesting that the Second Amendment is the right to protect yourself, going all the way through. I've been doing a series on YouTube on the amendment, on the Bill of Rights, and as a matter of fact, I'm already up to the 9th and 10th Amendment of the last one. I'll be doing that one next week, because they connect together.
Now, you have your own on YouTube channel, per se?
I have a channel on YouTube that I just started, and it's called Arena of History. You go to YouTube and do a search engine for Arena of History, you'll see I'm on a second or third listings on it or whatever. And I try to do weekly videos, assuming my wife isn't sick, and she helps me out with it a little bit. Last week she was sick, so I missed my video. But I have over a dozen videos right now on the amendments to the Constitution. I did one on the preamble to the Constitution, the opening of the Declaration of Independence. I also did one on DACA, because people hear DACA, but they don't know what it means. I did one on the FISA courts, because again, what's a FISA court? Just to define and bring out ideas for people to look at, because they hear it in the news, but the news does a little blurb and then 30 seconds and they're on to the next story. It's a good idea to be able to put it out and define people. This is what it is.
Now, what's the biggest misconception about those topics and maybe others that the public has that's totally not the truth, but that's what they believe because it's kind of how it's released to the public?
Well, the problem, I think, with the media right now in general, nothing personal, but is that the media's television media, the general broadcast channels are becoming pretty much irrelevant. You can get all the information you need from other sources. And because of that, they're becoming much more sensational. And they're pushing an agenda generally for the base they want to get to watch their channels. Basically, and people say there's not a taint in the media, but that's relative. I'm sorry, that's silly. If you watch CNN and MSNBC and then watch Fox News, there's obviously taint in the media.
Oh, it's huge. I find if I want the news, I go to the networks where they have to share, all the stories throughout the day. So maybe the lead story that's the only story on CNN is maybe the first 5 or 6 minutes, and then they've got all the stories that are fairly important for the day. So that's where I get the majority of my television news. I'm tired of listening to CNN harp on every breath that Trump takes. They're pissed off at him because he was slamming CNN. Then you go to Fox and he's like God. You go to CNN, he's the devil. And it's to the point where, okay, I just shift away from that and just use other sources. And a lot of print sources. And
again, print sources and online sources, you can get information on anything you want. Not to mention, again, YouTube. You can go to YouTube and hunt information down, including most of these broadcasts. You don't have to.
How to put taillights in the back of your car.
Well, I mean,
you just said a couple times.
I mean, things I've had to look up myself. Amazing what you can find on YouTube. My wife has a business, and I help a bit to run out of home. She dyes rovings and yarns commercially. I've had to learn how to build things for her so you get on YouTube and find what you need to do to learn how to build a Swift or how to build some device she needs. That's an amazing source. But my point about it is that the media has becoming less and less relevant. I mean, there are people on YouTube that have 1 million followers. I mean, CNN doesn't have 1 million followers.
No.
So, I mean, why would you, they become desperate. And it's not a big surprise. I mean, 80-90% of the media votes a particular direction, and they were alarmed. I think a lot of people were alarmed when Trump became president. But he's president of the United States. You support the president of the United States. You may not agree with him, but it's okay to support them that's what a patriotic person should do, support their government. The fact that we've had Barack Obama last time and Donald Trump this time tells you that the system works. The United States is quite capable of electing anybody, and you should support and see what they do.
You know what's interesting to me is I was watching CNN when the numbers were coming in during the election for Trump, and it was kind of interesting because you could see as things started shifting as the night went on, and then when it was announced that he won, I was looking at the group of reporters that they had on CNN, all the big ones, and you could see the look of shock. But then Wolf Blitzer, all of a sudden, he's looking around. You could see this big smile on his face because he realized what a huge story it was. And so then he came out and was talking about how big a story it was, and everybody else was shell-shocked, but he was smart enough to know this is huge. And so he just dove into it, and so
which is as you should. But yeah. Blitzer's amongst them is one of the more professional of them.
Right.
I mean, I try to listen to some of the news channels in general, and they're astonishingly biased. I mean,
But isn't that part of their program directors? It
is part of that,
and their editorial directors or whatever.
But I mean, and it's a business.
Sure.
They're realizing that those channels have a certain base in the United States only, and America is traditionally always broken up a third, and a third.
Right.
I mean, it had been a third that were more conservative, a third that were more liberal, and a third that are in the middle making the decisions back and forth. And we're still that way because ultimately elections are won by the undecided, the ones in the middle.
Yay, the middle, an Democrat. I'm a Democrat.
Well, and myself also. I mean, you register for a party, but I voted for Democrats, I voted for Republicans.
Me too. I've gone both ways.
And I mean, I think of myself more as what would be considered a classical liberal, but I'm talking about an 1800s liberal, closer to what would be a libertarian is now, though I have problems with the libertarians. But, it's it's an interesting phenomenon on what's happening with the news now. And I think in some ways it's alarming because we're not getting news from them, and the media is very important. It's the only job that's guaranteed in the Constitution is the free press. And if you're tainting that information so that it's not becoming inaccurate, then you're not a free press anymore. Now,
how do you feel about the demise of newspapers? Because I mean, they're shrinking, disappearing. Not every day are they delivered. The Tribune, Tacoma Tribune, is a shadow of itself. I mean, it's unbelievable.
I think it's sad, but not exactly unpredictable with the media, with the internet and the social media and all the access to information we have. Those papers should survive online is what they should do, is the best way, because I don't think you're going to get print. I personally like it. It's the idea of picking up. I like books too. I mean, I have my Kindle and I read books on it, but I much rather hold a book in my hand if I'm going to read it. But again, I'm an older man and I remember books. But I think it's a shame to see them go. But I think it's the way it is. I think we're going to be in electronic media entirely. Even television, I think, in some extent, is going to disappear as far as news is concerned.
Well, what's interesting, sometimes technology comes back. Like, for instance, vinyl is selling more now than it has in years, and cassettes are going to make a comeback. They're already talking about, because they're so handy to have. And because sometimes having something you can have in your hand that's not in a digital form and you can take with you and make copies of and hand to people, although they have to have the machines to listen to them, but
exactly.
But that's happening with turntables now. All of a sudden, you see turntables everywhere.
Vinyl, but it is made a comeback, but of course, I mean, the quality isn't nearly as good. But that's a whole other argument on it. I mean, I don't want to get your vinyl people screaming at me, because if you're a vinyl head, boy.
You don't have digital compresses it, so you don't have the same as an analog recording, right. but you do have the surface noise from the vinyl and scratches. Yeah, sure.
Built many of them, but anyway.
So how many people have come and viewed your YouTube channel?
Well, I've just started it, not a whole. I mean, I get decent amount of views, but I only have a dozen subscribers or something. I'm only getting going on it. But again, it gives me a medium to where I can put forth and talk about history, because I don't teach anymore, and which I enjoyed it a lot. But it's just an opportunity.
So how do you let people know you have it? Obviously, you're doing it on the radio, but I mean, how do you let people know it exists, or does YouTube do that for you?
YouTube does it to some extent. But people have to do search engines for it. If they look for one of the topics I'm on dealing, if someone typed in FISA court, then I might show up eventually. But since I'm a newcomer, I'm going to be very low on the list. But I'm trying to, find methods to promote it. Hopefully, from this, we'll get some people that'll look me up. And other methods, you can tie it to other Facebook channels. You can find other ways to advertise it and get back and forth. And it's an amazing place. I mean, there are people I listen to, for example, on YouTube, and you look at them, and 500,000 people are subscribers, or 10,000, even 10,000. You have to have at least 100 subscribers on YouTube, and then you get what's called a dedicated URL, meaning that you have a specific channel always. Whenever anybody, they'll always find that channel.
Now, do you charge money to be?
No, it's free. As a matter of fact, it works the opposite. If you if you get enough subscribers, then eventually you can run advertisements on your channel, and YouTube will actually give you a small money for being for doing it. I'm not in it for becoming rich and famous. Maybe famous would be okay, I guess, but I don't expect to get rich.
Get your idea.
The main thing is to get out there. I mean, I thought about it when I taught. I mean, I've taught thousands of students in my life, but you could reach thousands of people on a social media like YouTube in a day. I mean, what a better way to get out ideas and encourage people to have conversation, because that's the key factor in a lot of dealings with everything in this country. Is if you don't have the ability to talk, then you have if you disagree with someone and you can't discuss it with them, then the next course is violence. There's nothing else. I mean, if you and I have an argument, and if we can't discuss it, then we're going to have to fight.
Or walk away.
Or walk away.
Right.
But if you're, I mean, that's what we're seeing in the country right now, is that people will, I mean, I don't want to hear what you have to say. I'm going to violently protest someone giving a speech on something. I mean, that's ludicrous and narcissistic at an incredible level. Boy, you talk about having a big opinion of yourself, that your opinion is so valuable that you can't possibly listen to someone else's opinion. If you can defend your ideas, I mean, if you have an opinion and you haven't thought it through, then you don't actually have an opinion. You have somebody else's opinion, which means if you're going to use it, pay them royalties. Because the truth is, unless you've thought it through yourself, looked at both sides, and come up to an opinion, at that point you have an opinion. You have an educated opinion on something. If not else, you're just blowing smoke.
Yeah, but there's a lot of people that their minds are so warped that what they think is true is far from it. What do you do for those people?
Truth is never wrong. The truth is different than what people perceive. I mean, facts are something that you and I can both look at and agree upon. That's a fact. Opinion is another matter. And if there's a problem with people equating things that they personally relate to, emotion versus intellect. If you feel something, then you feel it, but it has nothing to do with me. If we're going to discuss an issue, then we need to sit there, and we have to, again, you have to find your terms. You have to come up with, what are we talking about here? What's your problem? Look at what I have. Look at what you have. Let's discuss it and come up with an opinion consensus between us on what we can agree on, and then go from there. People don't do that anymore, and it exists on the extreme right, and it exists on the extreme left. Unfortunately, on the left, I'm not so sure how extreme it is. It seems to be a lot more mainstream. I mean, again, some of the other channels, we're talking about the devaluing of the news media, because they're putting forth opinion and their feelings on issues rather than the facts.
But that's what people. Well, it's like talk radio. I mean, if you listen, there's people that will get all their information they get from talk radio. Now, if that's the case, then everything you get is slanted.
No kidding. And you need, you need to. But that's what I'm saying. It's okay to listen. And people listening to me right now, I want them to listen to what I have to say, but I also want them to actually challenge it. Go out and look at it. Find other people's opinions. That's the way it should be.
Well, we got a call coming in, but we also are falling behind on our break time, so we're going to take the break, and then we'll come back. It's KBKW's Coffee Talk. Let's go to our listener line. Hi, you're on the air.
Hello?
Yes. Hi, you're on the air.
Boy, Doug, I hope you have this individual back on.
Oh, you bet. See, they like you already.
Anyway, can you talk about sanctuary cities, and I'll take my answer off the air.
Okay, we'll get that. We'll get his opinion for you. What's your take on sanctuary cities?
Federal law trumps state law, trumps city law. So if you're basically, the issues of dealing with immigration fall explicitly in the powers of from the Constitution, from the federal government. So if the federal government wishes to, enforce its enforcement, and again, immigration is that issue. If people come into this country illegally, despite the fact that everyone wants to talk about immediately about, they're hardworking and all this, and I don't argue any of that, but they're still here illegally. If a sanctuary city, again, the federal government cannot compel the city or the state to do anything that isn't directly involved with the federal government. So if they want to say we're not going to give you ICE the information they need to have, it's hard to enforce that because there's a separation of powers between the federal and the states. Mm-hmm. It's supposed to be equal. The problem is, you also better be careful not taking money from the federal government or anything else from the federal government, because that is also something they can restrict also. That it comes out of their power.
It's kind of like with the marijuana laws in most states. The federal government doesn't support it. You can't put the money in the bank.
No, you have to be very careful with that because the federal dealing with marijuana, it is illegal at a federal level still.
But at one point it wasn't. Before Prohibition.
Well, yeah, of course, but but neither was opioids back then either. I mean, you could.
Yeah, so people can argue, well, it was fine back then. Why isn't it fine now? Of course, the abuse issue probably would be far worse. But then, I guess was it Sigmund Freud was addicted to cocaine, and I'm sure there was other presidents or Andrew Jackson obviously was addicted to alcohol.
We've had other ones that plenty of drinks.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the day that Prohibition started, there was a fellow that was supplying all of these congressmen and senators with big, huge bottles of booze and this was the day they signed the bill. It was really, really odd. And they actually showed a picture of this carriage. Let's go to our listener line. Hi, you're on the air.
Hi, good morning.
Hi.
I have a question. Do you think the judiciary has overstepped its bounds recently, or is this more historically? Have they always done that? It seems to me they're legislating from the judicial branch a little bit more than they have in the past.
I would agree on that the judiciary has overstepped its bounds. The issue on this exactly would fall into, again, President Trump and the whole travel ban nonsense that's going on. Again, the president has the regulation of immigration is the federal government, and because of laws passed in the late 50s and the 60s, a lot of that power was conveyed on the president of the United States on the right to restrict people coming into this country, which means judges really have nothing to do with it. They're not involved in the process. I mean, the Supreme Court could be. They're at the federal level, and you do have federal judges, but when you talk about the Ninth Circuit Court, again, the court that's been overturned 80% of the time when it has made a decision is saying you can't do this. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, no one argued when Jimmy Carter blocked immigration from Iraq during the Iraq hostage crisis. I know Barack Obama restricted immigration. In fact, the list Trump was restricting on, the president was using was actually the list that the Obama administration had put forth of nations that needed to be, because you couldn't vet those informations coming from those areas.
Well, thank you. I had that perception, but I haven't researched it enough to know. But thank you for your information.
Right,
you're welcome.
Thanks for the call, John. Let's go to our next caller. Hi, you're on the air. We have about 90 seconds left.
Okay, so I agree that immigration falls into the executive branch, but if he does a travel ban that specifically discriminates against someone because of their religion, isn't that appropriate for the Ninth Circuit to intervene?
You'd have to argue that he did it specifically for religion. The country, there are over 1 billion Muslims in the world, and there are a vast number of those nations that aren't on that ban. So wouldn't he be blocking those nations too if he was specifically trying to block just Muslims? How about just nations that don't vet their people so you can actually find out who's coming over?
Yes. Well, they did argue based on religion, and the nation that had the most people in 9/11 and in our 9/11 disaster was excluded from the ban.
You're talking about Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
But again, that was a dozen people who came in through other means. The countries you're talking about, if you're talking about Somalia, there's no way to get information accurately from Somalia.
If you wish to join the quest for knowledge, the battle for truth, please hit the like button, recommend my channel to others, and of course, subscribe. Thank you kindly.